guidance that we not focus on learning about the other religion, but rather strive to grow in understanding of the other religion. And in order to do this, one must be somewhere. One must be rooted in one's own tradition. As theological learners, we begin by learning our own tradition, and then through recognition of other religions, we encounter the other, and we listen to their articulations of who they are and what their experiences and practices that constitute the world of their community are, in Judith Burling's words. The learnings from the other, the growth in the understanding of the other, is not, as Burling says, easy or comfortable. There is always some loss of inward ease, an overturning of comfortable assumptions and cherished truths. But the second step seeks not to compare, but to receive the explanations and to observe rituals. And then the third step is the passing over and a coming back. In other words, the passing over into another religious tradition may have confirmed in our coming back that our experiences and values with which we began remain. Or, perhaps, the encounter lifted up issues that seem wrong, that need to be addressed within one's own community. In either case, Burling says, we must determine, what do I make of what I have been made? How are we Christians to understand our own tradition in a deeper way, having encountered and come to understand something about another religious system? So if we take that process, comparative theology in a pastoral format, if we take this process and we bring it to ecumenical encounter and prayer, it of course requires a shift. Christians share a common set of basic beliefs and more fundamentally a common baptism, and therefore are members one of another. But the work in adapting comparative theology to ecumenical encounters has emerged in several ways. One way that I think is quite helpful is often called receptive ecumenism. Paul Murray says that the central idea of receptive ecumenism requires that churches make what he calls a programmatic shift from asking, what do our dialogue partners need to learn from us, to asking what we need to learn and what can we learn from our dialogue partners. Receptive ecumenism should take churches to the next step, building on these theoretical outcomes and looking for concrete expressions in each church's own life. In other words, receptive ecumenism is not just about theological dialogue, but particularly moves to the core expressions of who we are, most notably and most often in prayer, in corporate prayer. What do we receive from praying together as Christians, standing in a particularity of a Christian tradition and expression, confident that the gifts of our own practices may be helpful to others, willing to listen, to understand, and to receive the gifts of others? How do we expect to be changed and to be challenged by the encounters in prayer? For our conversation today on the context of prayer book revision, deep ecumenism, perhaps this is the fourth wave of ecumenism here, raises two issues that affect the conversation differently now than it was in the 1960s and 1970s. Having lived for 40 years with a prayer book that is itself a product of the ecumenical liturgical movement, who are Episcopalians? We have to stand somewhere, and we have to be rooted in our own tradition to engage in interfaith dialogue and in ecumenical dialogue. Who are Episcopalians? The 1928 prayer book, what many have called the last Cranmerian liturgy, was already impacted by the Oxford movement, of course, in ritualism, and we heard about that this morning. But as far as the crystallization of identity, it was very different than the Eucharistically centered Catholic ecumenism represented in the 1979 prayer book. Where is the unity of faith? What is the particularity of theology and therefore liturgy, or if you prefer, the particularity of liturgy and therefore theology, that Anglicans bring to ecumenical conversation and offer to others, as well as receive? And what is the ecclesiology without which Episcopalians cannot be rooted in their own tradition, without which they are unable to articulate similarities and differences in a conversation of comparative theology, whether it be interfaith or ecumenical? Second arena to focus on a little bit. Formation as socialization or formation as information. We started this conversation last night at the pub, and I think it's just been ongoing since then. Of course, because of its liturgical innovations in the 16th century, Anglicanism has always lived with the danger of making the liturgy into a classroom. Cranmer needed to teach Scripture, creed, prayer in the vernacular. And so we end up with, and working in the Anglican Church of Canada, we were talking about this, remember we still have a BCP and a sort of 1979 prayer book. We end up with these differences. The lesson is written in the 4th chapter of St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, beginning at the 1st verse. That's different than a reading from the Acts of the Apostles. Changing the language and the structure of the Eucharistic liturgy in the 1979 prayer book reveals a different theology of the proclamation of the Word. And it's interesting, in the 1979 prayer book, I'm reading from the Acts of the Apostles, but there is the option of continuing chapter and verse, a previous theology that suggests they are the same theology of proclamation. They're not. One is a didactic lesson in learning Scripture. The other is the living, active Word proclaimed in our midst. So we don't even have to go to the Eucharistic prayer and all of its BCP oddness. We can actually just stick with the liturgy of the Word. So that kind of series of examples, if you will, extends throughout the prayer book in places of obvious compromise. It's a group that wrote the prayer book, right? A prayer book that began and ended in a very different place, this 1979, than the 1928 prayer book, but often absent the particularity of Anglican ethos, culture, and practice. With no theological introduction, literally, in the Lacca Praenotanda in the book itself, and at the parish level in catechesis in many places, we have a lot of communities who still understand the liturgy as the words, rather than as an action of God and of the whole Church, let alone the temporal and spatial realities at odds with the 1979 book. I was telling people this past Sunday was just one of those I just wanted to sort of twitch. I had an 8 o'clock liturgy at a parish, which is BCP, and for that community, Easter was done. It wasn't Easter anymore. It was the Sunday after the Ascension, because Easter's only 40 days long. But then at 11 o'clock, it was still Easter. It was the 7th Sunday of Easter. And it's just, so we don't need the Paschal candle downstairs, but we do need it upstairs. It's not, and I actually preached about it. I said, folks, it's not a matter of adding ETH to the ends of all the words. They're profoundly different understandings of how we use space, how we use time, let alone that Eucharistic prayer and the readings. So, spatial, temporal differences on top of everything else. Is this any different, however, than the challenges encountered in the 1970s? I suspect there are similarities, but there is certainly a difference of lived experience in catechesis that has changed. In other words, certainly not everybody was perfectly catechized in every Episcopal parish in the 1970s. But the differences of lived experience in catechesis have changed. I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that already by 1978, 48% of American Episcopalians came as adults from other ecclesial communities. That the statistics tell us one story, but the reality was that even then, many of them came from other Christian denominations. They came catechized. They came filled with information about Christianity where that was a societal norm in many places. In 2017, we joke about the uncatechized baptized. Actually, we weren't even joking about it in the conversation following Frank's talk, but we did talk about this quite a bit. We joke about the uncatechized baptized if they are baptized. but many are now second generation uncatechized. So the domestic church influence is often not there either. The United States is an oddity. In Canada, we're about 3 generations out now from Anglican churchgoers. So I'm seeing perhaps a few grandparents still bring their grandchildren to church, but that's becoming rare. And of course in England, it's actually often 4 generations out from any engagement in the church. The tendency in some parishes is to respond to this by reverting to the liturgy as classroom, because this is the only setting in which to educate people about the liturgy, to give them information. Paul Marshall addressed this already in 1997 when he expressed concern about the unwillingness to make room for ecstasy and beauty, which in his words requires room for ways of knowing or perceiving that soar above the products of reason or revelation. But his sense of what parish priests were doing as an attempted cure for this lack was to claim personal experience articulated in feeling the right things as the new catechesis. This is not the same as ecstasy, which is a personal surrender of rationalism, not into irrationalism as much as into non-rationalism. Marshall quipped, and this, I love his little sentence, "Nothing induces alienation or sleep faster than a sermon explaining how we should feel at certain ritual moments, regardless of whether the topic is balloons or monstrances." Gotta love it. But the era of instructed Eucharist still continues, as the encounter between heaven and earth is reduced to a series of explanations and demonstrations. In a way, this very much fits with the growing concerns of the impact of the digital revolution on our ability to do liturgy, where the self-instrumentalization model, so using ourselves or others using us as instruments, this is a model of online giants such as Facebook. So, I'm on Facebook, but this is where Facebook reminds us, or those who critique it remind us, you, the customer, are not in a relationship with Facebook. It's not your friend. You are simply the raw material sold to the advertisers through your own constant self-disclosures of needs and wants. And of course, self-instrumentalization results in destroying authentic relationality and transforms the other from subject to object. James Picamo continues by saying, as he's written a lot about this, he says, we can easily transfer this to the liturgy, which can be seen as a machine, very similar to what you were saying earlier. He says a regular, standardized, and repeatable procedure that reliably produces particular outcomes and then gives the correct inputs, or given the correct inputs, produces these outcomes. Now, I need to acknowledge at this point within the United States 2 realities. One, the Episcopal Church varies tremendously from place to place, among other things. I know that parishes in Virginia, I'm going to guess, are very different than parishes in San Francisco. So I began my address to the gathering of Societas Liturgica a couple years ago by describing a parish quizzing me as I applied for their rector position. In a desperate attempt to fill the pews and their minuscule Sunday school, they suggested we simply drop the Christian emphasis so that the neighborhood children, who are mostly Jewish and Hindu and Taoist, would feel much more welcome. I'm not making this up. But the juxtaposition of a new depth of uncatechized parishioners, cultural changes around them, and all sorts of other things. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what we were on the phone, so I couldn't just go bang my head against the wall. How can you say that? Let's make the Sunday school not Christian so we can get some more kids in. But I think in addition to this one example, the as yet unknown depth of the impact of the digital revolution has certainly created different challenges in 2017 as well, at that particular parish, but also elsewhere. I said there were 2 realities. The second one is that the recognition of symbolic illiteracy is not something that began in the last couple of years. Many fine scholars have written on this over a number of decades, expressing a concern of a lack of imagination. And it's interesting the response to that, so catechetical responses like the Catechesis of the Good Shepherd, like Godly Play, have this lack of imagination, how we're going to deal that. Or a need for didactic rather than evocative language. I was telling a story last night that I had amazing theological conversation with parishioners on Sunday after the liturgies, trying to, if it's not literal and if it's not literally true in Scripture or in liturgy, is there any truth at all? You know, how do we negotiate that? But I think it's really interesting that one of my former teachers, Jake Emperor, has actually written about how this happens in work on inclusive language too. That in our desire to have more inclusive language, we often actually turn away from metaphor and from evocative language towards the didactic. So it happens in the least expected places. These theological